She was the richest woman in America, and she was dressed like a pauper. A single black gown worn until it frayed, a heavy mourning veil, a battered black bag of railroad bonds in her lap. Cold oatmeal warmed on a bank radiator. They called her the Witch of Wall Street, and they whispered that she had let her own son's leg rot rather than settle a doctor's bill. Hetty Green was not the only widow who took what the men had kept from her. A grocer's daughter bought her way into the ballroom that had barred its door. A woman signed a dead man's name to save his empire. A queen handed a fortune her husband's own lawyers begged him to withhold, turned $8 million into 20. In an age when a wife owned almost nothing, only one thing ever set a woman free: her husband's death. If a story told this way is why you are here, subscribe and stay close. 4 widows, 4 thrones seized from 4 dead men, and I want you with me all the way to the last of them. Chapter 1. The only door that ever opened. In the eyes of the law, a married woman of the Gilded Age owned almost nothing. Not her money, not her wages, if she was poor enough to earn any, not her property, and in many places not even her own children. She could stand at the head of a marble dining table wearing a fortune in diamonds, hostess to senators and dukes, and be, in the cold arithmetic of the statute books, a kind of beautiful furniture. The rule that made her so was called coverture, and it was old, and it was brutal in its simplicity. When a woman married, her legal person folded into her husband's. Whatever had been hers became his the moment the vows were spoken, and it did not come back. The reach of it is hard to feel from here. A wife could not vote. She could rarely divorce without ruin. In most of the country, she could not sign a contract in her own name or keep her own earnings without her husband's leave. If she inherited a fortune, the fortune crossed the aisle to the man beside her. If she earned a wage, the wage was his to take. He could keep a mistress in the open, gamble the family into the ground, drink himself violent, and the law would still call the house and everything in it his. She could do almost nothing, and own almost nothing. And the more money the marriage held, the more finely worked the bars became. The richer the husband, in plain terms, the more gilded the prison, and the more a wife stood to lose by the one act that might have freed her, a scandalous and ruinous divorce that respectable society would never forgive. The Married Women's Property Acts had begun, state by uneven state, to file away at the oldest edges of the rule. But for most of the lives in this story, the cage held in every way that mattered. A woman inside a great Gilded Age marriage had everything the world could see and no power the world would protect. She was an ornament, chosen the way a house was chosen, or a painting, dressed to be looked at and told to want nothing more. And the fortunes that the rule protected were vast, beyond anything the country had ever seen. The men who made them in railroads and steel and cotton and gold held wealth that could buy a legislature, build a cathedral, and lay a marble palace on a Newport cliff in a single summer, and the women who married that money were handed a glittering piece of it to carry and told to ask for nothing further. There was a market in the whole arrangement, conducted in the open, where families with new fortunes and no pedigree shipped their daughters across the ocean to trade a father's cash for a title, a coronet for a railroad heiress, a European dukedom bought outright with new American money. A daughter was an asset, a wife was an ornament, and the more money a marriage held, the more finely the bars were worked, and the more completely the woman inside was owned, because a great fortune wanted a beautiful keeper, and the law made certain the keeper could never become the owner. That was the world these 4 women were born to marry into. And yet there was one door, one narrow door in the whole locked house of a woman's life, and it had a cruel condition on it. It opened only when the man died. Widowhood was the single event that could turn the ornament into the owner, the performer into the proprietor, because the fortune a wife could never touch became, on the day of the funeral, at least partly hers to command. The black she was made to wear to bury him was the colour of grief. It was also, for the women clever enough and hard enough to use it, the colour of a key. This is the story of 4 of them. 4 American widows who stood at that door and walked through it and seized what the law and the men had spent their whole married lives keeping from their hands. They did not seize the same thing, and that is the shape of what follows. The film climbs. It begins with a woman who took the smallest throne of the 4, a place at a table, a name on a list, the right to be received in the drawing rooms of people who had sneered at her. It ends with a woman who took the largest throne there was, the money markets of the United States, and paid for it in a currency you would not wish on anyone. Between them stand 2 more. A woman who took a dead man's business and a dead man's name and ran both. A woman who took a fortune everyone expected her to lose and doubled it in a Florida swamp. Marietta Stevens, Miriam Leslie, Bertha Palmer, and Hetty Green, waiting at the end in her veil. Each of them was handed her freedom by a coffin, and each of them, in her way, paid it back. One of them said it plainest, from the far side of her own escape, and her words hang over all 4 lives like an epigraph. It is the duty of every woman, she said, to learn to take care of her own business affairs. She had learned it the hard way, so had the 3 who came before her. Chapter 2. The grocer's daughter they would not receive. Before New York learned to fear her dinners, Marietta Reed was a grocer's daughter from Lowell, Massachusetts, that the city's oldest families would not let through the door. The sneer they used against her when they troubled to name her at all was exactly that. A grocer's daughter. And here is the strange thing, the thing that tells you everything about how the old families fought. The sneer was true, and it was still a lie. Her father, Ransom Reed, had indeed made his early money in the greengrocer trade. He had then gone into politics and become a state senator from Lowell, a wealthy and elected man. His daughter had grown up comfortable and connected. The words grocer's daughter carried none of that. They were built to make a listener picture gutters and aprons, to reduce a senator's child to something that smelled of the shop, and society deployed them with a smile. She married up, and she married a man the same set looked down on for the same reason. Marietta Stevens was a self-made hotel king, 25 years her senior, and to old New York, the word hotel was very nearly as damning as the word grocer. He had begun with a coffee shop in Boston. He had bought his way into the Revere House and come to own it, taken the Tremont, leased the great new Fifth Avenue Hotel, and built the Continental in Philadelphia. He had the finest wine cellar in America, a palate famous across 2 continents, and a fortune reckoned at something over $5 million. The jewel of that fortune was the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and it was a wonder of the age. It had cost some $2 million to raise, carried a fireplace in every room, kept a staff of 400 servants, and ran the first passenger elevator the country had ever seen, a strange vertical screw railway that lifted astonished guests up through the floors. Marietta Stevens ran it, and it made him one of the richest men in New York and one of the least welcome, because a marble palace was still, to the old families, a place of trade, and its keeper was still a man who sold rooms and wine for money. That was the paradox Marietta married into. Her husband owned the grandest public house in America and could not get his own wife through the private doors that counted, and she would spend 2 decades learning every inch of that wall before she found the single gap in it. What he did not have, and what his wife would spend the rest of her life trying to buy, was the one thing money could not simply purchase: acceptance. The Stevenses were trade. They were new, and new, in the New York of the 400, was a wound that did not heal. They married in Lowell in the summer of 1851. For 2 decades, Marietta lived as the wife of a very rich man who was not quite allowed to matter, watching the doors of the drawing rooms that counted stay shut against her, learning the exact geography of the walls that held her out. She was, by every account, sharp, ambitious, impulsive, quick with a remark, a woman who felt her exclusions keenly and forgot none of them. And she was married, which meant that the fortune she watched Paran spend was his to spend, and the position she wanted was his to fail to secure. And there was nothing she could do but wait on the far side of the door. 20 years is a long time to stand outside a door. She spent them studying the city that would not have her, memorizing its hierarchies and its cruelties, watching the patriarch's balls from the wrong side of the guest list, and banking every slight against a day she could not yet see coming. When the day came, it came dressed as grief. Paran Stevens died in the spring of 1872, and the will read over him was a careful, cautious document that treated his widow exactly as the age treated all widows, as a danger to be managed rather than a partner to be trusted. It gave her $100,000 outright, and the income, for her lifetime only, of $1 million more, while the body of the estate, some $300,000 in appraised personal property and a great deal of real estate besides, went into trusts for his children, run by trustees, the principal fenced away from her hand. On paper, she had been left a comfortable cage. But a cage with its door standing open is only a room, and Marietta Stevens, at last, was the one who would decide when to walk out of it. The city she wanted into was ruled, in those years, by a machinery as precise as any railroad. At its head stood Caroline Astor, the woman the newspapers simply called the Mrs. Astor, and at her side stood her lieutenant, a fastidious social arbiter named Ward McAllister, who had done the arithmetic of exclusion and given it a number: 400. That, he announced, was the count of people in New York who truly mattered, the number, it was said, that would fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. To be on the list was to exist. To be left off it, however many millions your husband had made that year, was to be nobody. McAllister ran the patriarch's balls that policed the boundary, and the boundary was built precisely to keep out people like the Stevenses, whose money was new and whose money smelled of the trade that had made it. Marietta studied that machinery the way a general studies a fortress. She had the wines. Paran's legendary cellar was hers to pour. She had the chef, the rooms, the will, and a grievance 20 years deep. What she did not yet have was the freedom to use them as she pleased, because a wife moved at her husband's pace and under her husband's name, and Paran, for all his hotels, had never quite forced the door. Then, in the spring of 1872, Paran Stevens died, and everything changed. His will stopped short of handing her the fortune whole. It made her, in the language of the trusts, a life tenant. She would draw the income from $1 million held for her lifetime and take $100,000 outright, while the bulk of the estate went into separate trusts for his children, run by trustees, the principal locked away from her direct hand. On paper, she had not inherited a throne at all. She had inherited a widow's portion and a set of chains dressed as a bequest. But paper was one thing, and the woman was another. Marietta Stevens was 45 and free, and she had 2 decades of closed doors to answer for. The morning had barely begun before New York began to understand what a mistake it had made in leaving her outside. Chapter 3. She bought the house that barred her. Mary Mason Jones would not receive Marietta Stevens, so Marietta waited for her to die and moved into her house. That single fact is the whole of Marietta's story, compressed to a hard, bright point, and it repays a slow, careful look because it is the truest thing the record holds about her. Mary Mason Jones was old New York to the marrow, a great aunt of a girl named Edith Jones, who would grow up to be Edith Wharton, and she held a mansion at 1 East 57th Street that Marietta was not permitted to enter. Jones considered her a climber, which she was, and refused her the door, which was the one weapon the old families truly had. And then Mary Mason Jones died, and the climber she had shut out acquired the mansion and held court in the very rooms that had been forbidden her. The door that was slammed became the door she owned. She did it with food and wine and relentless, tireless hospitality. She gave, a contemporary wrote, some of the finest dinners in the city. Her wines were of the best. Her chef had few superiors, and her hospitality was unbounded. She threw open her house for musicales, Sunday evening parties built around singers and players, and she used them as a battering ram against a wall that had no other gate. You could not, in the end, keep refusing a woman whose table was the best in New York, whose wine was Paran Stevens's incomparable cellar, whose invitations the interesting people had begun to accept. One by one, the doors that had closed against the hotel keeper's wife opened to the hotel keeper's widow, because a widow with $1 million of income and the finest chef in the city was a force that even the 400 could not indefinitely pretend away. Her obituary, when it came, named the engine of her without quite meaning to. She was an ambitious woman, it said, keen for social prestige, and she stamped out everything that stood in the pathway of her ambition. She was equally well known, it added, in New York, Paris, London, Berlin, and Vienna, and it recorded, almost tenderly, a habit of hers, a favourite jest that the public picked out nothing but her faults. She knew what they said about her. She made a joke of it and kept climbing. She climbed hardest through her children, because the widow who could not be fully received in New York could aim one generation higher and one ocean away, where American gatekeepers could not reach. Her daughter, Mary Fisk Stevens, called Minnie, she carried to Europe and marketed like the great heiress the newspapers billed her as. The billing outran the money. When a French duke discovered that Minnie's fortune was smaller than advertised, he withdrew his suit, and Minnie married instead an Englishman, Sir Arthur Paget, grandson of a marquis. It was one of the earliest of the great transatlantic title marriages, years before the flood of dollar princesses that followed, and it worked beyond any drawing room Marietta could have stormed at home. The Prince of Wales himself, the future king, called upon the bride, and later stood godfather to her daughter. The grocer's granddaughter curtsied inside the circle of the man who would be King of England. Minnie made a whole life of it. She settled at Belgrave Square in the heart of aristocratic London, moved in the fast, glittering set around the Prince of Wales, and became in time a marriage broker in her own right, arranging matches for the next wave of American heiresses crossing the water in search of titles. During the war in South Africa, she staged a great charity spectacle, a masque of peace and war, and raised £7,000 with it. The mother had aimed one generation higher than the New York doors would ever open, and the aim had carried clean across an ocean and into a palace. Whatever Marietta could not win in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, her daughter won in the drawing rooms of an empire, and no gatekeeper on Fifth Avenue could reach her there. There was a price, and her son paid it. Harry Stevens, Marietta's boy, courted that same Edith Jones, the niece of the woman who had barred the door, and in the summer of 1882, their engagement was announced. a wedding set for the autumn. It never came. The engagement was broken off in the very month it was to end in marriage, and the society paper that reported it gave a reason. So cutting, it has outlived everyone involved. The match had failed, it said, because of an alleged preponderance of intellectuality on the part of the intended bride. Edith Jones, in other words, was too clever. The insiders told a colder story. Harry was 23, and under his father's trust, his money stayed in his mother's control until he married or turned 25, and a marriage would have sprung it loose. The whisper was that Marietta broke her son's engagement to keep her son's fortune. He never married. He died 3 years later, at about 26. And because he died unmarried, the money stayed exactly where his mother could reach it. That same year, the girl he had been forbidden married a man named Edward Wharton and began the long climb to becoming the greatest novelist her wounded world would ever produce. Years later, Edith Wharton would set a woman very like Marietta at the centre of her finest novel, a low-born widow named Mrs. Lemuel Struthers, a shoe-polish fortune behind her, who forces her way into old New York on the strength of her Sunday evening musicals until the people who once cut her turn up smiling at her parties. The girl judged too clever, for the climbing widow's son would live to immortalize the climbing widow herself. Marietta had taken the smallest throne in this film, and she had taken it completely. A place at the table, a name on the list, the house of the enemy who had shut her out. She seized a doorway, and she died behind it in 1895, received at last by the city that had spent 30 years pretending she did not exist. But a doorway is a small thing to seize in the end, and the woman who comes next was after far more than a room in someone else's house. She wanted a business of her own, an empire of printing presses and illustrated papers, and when it fell to her drowning in debt, she reached for a weapon Marietta never dreamed of. She took a dead man's name and wore it like a suit of armor. Chapter 4. The Girl Who Erased Herself. Nobody, not even Miriam Leslie, could say for certain who her mother was, and she spent 78 years making sure of it. She was born in New Orleans in the middle 1830s, or so she said, under the name Miriam Florence Follin, though even the year moved when it suited her to move it. Her father was a cotton man of no great steadiness, and her mother was a woman he had never married, which made the daughter illegitimate in the plain speech of the time. Her biographer, a scholar named Betsy Priolo, has argued that the mother may have been a black woman of the household, enslaved, or lately so, and that the whole glittering aristocratic self that Miriam built across her life was a wall raised against that single buried fact. It is an argument rather than a proof, and it must be held as one. But if it is right, then the most frightening thing about Miriam Leslie is that we still cannot say for certain who she was, because she did not want us to, and she was very good at her work. What is certain is that she reinvented herself so many times that the truth wore smooth beneath the retellings. She learned languages, 4 of them, and placed an anonymous essay in a New York paper before she was 15. At 17 or 18, she was pushed into a marriage with a jeweler's clerk named Peacock under a threat from her own mother, and the marriage was annulled inside 2 years. That first husband, a small, unhappy footnote, would end his life in an asylum, which is a detail worth keeping because it does not stay a coincidence. Not long after, she appeared on the stage of the northeastern cities billed as Minnie Montez, the younger sister of the notorious dancer and royal mistress Lola Montez, a woman who was no kin to her at all and had simply taken the girl up after a family drowning. A teenager displayed under a scandalous star's name as bait for a paying crowd. It was the shape of her whole youth, a self offered up for what it could earn. She married again, an archaeologist and diplomat named Ephraim Squire, a distinguished man some 15 years her elder, and it is here that the story turns genuinely strange. Into the Squire household came a publisher, Frank Leslie, born plain Henry Carter in England, who had built the largest illustrated press in America. Leslie boarded with the married couple, made the husband his managing editor, and by the accounts that later reached the divorce courts, was living with the wife as though she were already his own. In one grotesque episode, the three of them travelled to Europe together after Leslie had quietly arranged for Squire to be arrested abroad over a debt. When Frank Leslie's own estranged wife sued him for divorce, the papers named the other woman as Miriam, and Squire, the cast-off husband, went the way of the first one. His mind failed, and a court in due course declared him a lunatic, incapable of the government of himself. 2 husbands, 2 asylums. A woman does not arrange such things, and yet the pattern sat behind her like a shadow she could never quite outwalk. She married Frank Leslie in 1874 and became the queen of his kingdom of paper. The Leslie house printed a dozen titles, the great illustrated newspaper among them, and employed nearly 400 people. And Miriam ran and edited pieces of it herself, with a hand the office learned to fear. She wore a fortune in diamonds, $70,000 of them at a single reception, kept a box at the opera and a house at Saratoga, and styled herself, when the mood took her, a baroness, the Baroness de Bazus, a title she had quite simply invented and pinned to a fictional line of French Huguenot nobles. The kingdom she presided over was genuinely large. The flagship illustrated newspaper had once reached a circulation of 164,000. The house printed something like a dozen titles at a time, and nearly 400 people drew their wages from it. She had been a working editor for years before her husband died, a woman who knew the business from the inside and ran real parts of it herself. Behind the glamour, the private arrangements were stranger than any reader guessed. Before Frank Leslie ever married her, he had boarded in her house while she was still another man's wife, had quietly arranged for that husband to be arrested abroad over a debt so that the 3 of them might travel on to Europe together, and had been named at last in a divorce suit as the man who had taken her from Squire. She had built her rise inside a scandal, and papered the scandal over with diamonds and a borrowed coronet, and it held, because holding such things was the one art she had practiced her whole life. She was building the same wall as the woman before her, a wall of glamour and invented pedigree against a past that could destroy her, and for a while it held beautifully. Then the whole thing came down. The panic of 1877 fell on the country and on the overextended Leslie house together, and the empire slid toward collapse. And in the middle of the ruin, in the first month of 1880, Frank Leslie died and left his widow the wreck of his kingdom. The presses were still running. So was the debt. Something on the order of $300,000 of it, a mountain of obligation resting on a business the courts had already dragged toward receivership, and a woman who, in the eyes of every creditor and every editor of the age, had no business trying to hold any of it. She was a woman. Women did not run publishing houses. The empire was finished, and everyone in New York knew it. Everyone except the widow, who had one idea, and it was the strangest and boldest thing any woman in this film would ever do. Chapter 5. The Widow Who Signed a Dead Man's Name. On the 4th of June, 1881, a widow walked into a New York court and legally changed her own name to Frank Leslie. Not Mrs. Frank Leslie, not the widow Leslie. Frank Leslie, the man, the masthead, the trademark that all those creditors and all those readers trusted. She took her dead husband's whole masculine name for her own, so that the business could go on being run by Frank Leslie, because she now was Frank Leslie, in the plain language of the law. It is one of the most audacious acts of self-transformation the century produced, and she did it as a deliberate strategy, to hold clean title to the name the empire was sold under, and to run that empire herself in a world that would not let a woman do it under her own. Then she saved the company, and the way she saved it belongs in any honest history of American business. She stripped the bloated list of titles down to the ones that could pay. She found money where a woman was not supposed to find it, borrowing $50,000 from a wealthy Brooklyn widow and pledging her diamonds as the security. Her cry in that hour survives. If only, she said, I could find a woman with $50,000 to lend. And then the century handed her a terrible piece of luck, and she seized it without hesitation. In July of that same year, a gunman shot President Garfield, and the president lingered for months, and the whole country hungered for pictures of the dying man and the manhunt and the trial. Miriam Leslie rushed her artists to Washington and poured the illustrated coverage out, and the circulation of the flagship paper leapt from around 30,000 to 200,000. She repaid the $50,000 loan days before the first installment was even due, and took her diamonds back out of pawn, and turned the wreck her husband had left into a fortune again, drawing something like $100,000 a year at the height of it. They crowned her, in the press, the Empress of Journalism. She had earned every letter of it. The numbers of the rescue tell the story better than any crown. The house had gone into receivership carrying debts of $355,000. Within a few years, she had cleared every dollar of them and was drawing something near $100,000 a year at the height of her reign. In time, she sold the flagship paper for $300,000 or $400,000 and sold out the last of her publishing interests around the turn of the century for something like $500,000 more. A woman the whole trade had written off as a helpless widow had taken a bankrupt empire and turned it back into a fortune under a dead man's name, and the trade could neither forgive it nor explain it. She was, by then, a genuinely powerful woman running a genuinely large business under a dead man's name, and she never stopped being the other thing as well, the girl outrunning a past that could still ruin her. Late in life, she made a last, disastrous marriage to a charming drunk named William Wilde, the older brother of Oscar. He was penniless and idle, and Miriam disposed of him with the same clean ruthlessness she brought to a failing title. Shipping him back to London, she pronounced the sentence that the London papers gleefully turned into a placard. He was, she said, of no use to me, either by day or by night. She had married, she remarked, the wrong Wilde, and added that she really should have married Oscar. Once, taking her own measure, she reached past all of it for something older and darker. I am afraid, she said, I am Lilith, naming herself for the first woman of the old legends, the one who would not submit and fled the garden for a paradise of her own making. And then, at the very end, she turned the whole strange fortune outward, and it is the turn that redeems the erasures. Miriam Leslie died in the autumn of 1914, and her will left the bulk of her estate, something near $2 million, to a single woman she trusted to spend it well. Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of the suffrage movement, was to have it, in the words of the will, for the furtherance of the cause of woman's suffrage. The relatives descended and fought the will for years, and the lawyers took their share. But when the dust cleared, very nearly $1 million reached the cause. The courts awarded Catt $500,000 outright, along with the dead woman's jewels, and by the time the taxes and the fees were paid, the sum that actually reached the movement came to something near $978,000. Cat refused to let it vanish into ordinary accounts. She built a press bureau of some 24 people with it, a professional engine of pro-suffrage words that fed the newspapers of the nation by the hundreds of thousands a year, bankrolled the movement's own weekly paper, and drove the final campaign for the vote. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and American women could at last vote, one veteran of the fight said the plain thing about the widow's money. She sometimes wondered, she said, whether they would still be climbing the steps of the Capitol if Mrs. Leslie had not made that bequest. The arc of that life is almost too much to take in at once. A girl of buried and possibly enslaved origins, sold on a stage under a false sister's name, married 4 times, twice into asylums, who erased herself so thoroughly that we cannot find her mother, became a dead man on paper to save an empire, and left the empire's money to buy millions of women the vote she herself had never been permitted to cast. Her collapse to a single image is her own hand moving across a legal page, signing, in her own script, the name Frank Leslie. She took a business and a name and a fortune the men had held, and she gave the fortune back to her whole sex. Marietta seized a doorway. Miriam seized an empire built on debt. The widow who comes next was handed something neither of them ever touched, a fortune already made, already vast, already hers, and a chorus of men certain she would lose every dollar of it. Chapter 6. The Queen They Expected to Fail. When Bertha Palmer sat down to write his will, leaving his entire fortune to his wife, his own lawyers begged him to reconsider, certain that a widow would squander it. The story of what she did with their doubt is the sunniest in this film, and it is here on purpose, a widow who won cleanly, in the open, and paid the smallest visible price of the 4. Her name was Bertha Honorée Palmer, and for a generation she had been something no coronet could confer and no old family could withhold. She was the Queen of Chicago, the undisputed sovereign of the society of the great, raw, booming city of the American Middle, and she had come to the throne young. She had been born in Kentucky in 1849 and raised in Chicago, unusually well educated for a girl of her time, a graduate with honors in a long list of subjects from logic to astronomy. At 21, she married Bertha Palmer, a merchant prince, 23 years her senior, who had built one of the country's great fortunes and then handed her a city to rule. Palmer had made his money in dry goods, in a store so far ahead of its age that it invented the ideas we now take for granted: the money-back guarantee, the bargain day, the principle that the customer was always right. He sold that store into what became Marshall Field and Company, poured the proceeds into State Street real estate, and built a grand hotel, the Palmer House, as a wedding gift to his bride. 13 days after it opened, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 burned it to the ground, along with half the city. Palmer borrowed $1.75 million, said to be the largest loan ever made to a private man to that date, and rebuilt it grander, and advertised it as the only fireproof hotel in the world. His young wife, in the crisis, had wired the Eastern financiers herself to shore up his credit. The steel was in her early, under the pearls. She spent the next 3 decades as the most powerful hostess in the middle of the country, and she filled her reign with things that outlived it. She built, on Lakeshore Drive, a limestone castle of 42 rooms with a tower and a great domed hall, a house so guarded that it had, famously and truly, no doorknob or lock on the outside of any door, so that no one could enter or leave it without a servant to let them through. She hung its walls with a taste decades ahead of her cities, buying the French Impressionists when America still thought them daubs, choosing every canvas herself with her own eye. a Degas for $500 to start, and in time as many as 90 works by Monet, the collection that would one day become the heart of the Art Institute of Chicago. She bought against the taste of her whole country. When America still called the Impressionists daubs and jokes, Bertha Palmer was buying Monet by the armful, advised by the painter Mary Cassatt, hanging a Renoir of acrobats over her own bed and stacking her walls with haystacks and shimmering river light. She made every purchase herself, trusted her own eye over the sneers of the critics, and was proven right so completely that the canvases a doubting age thought foolish now form the pride of a great museum. That eye is the thing to hold on to, because it is the same faculty that would carry her through the years ahead. The men who priced her husband's fortune and shook their heads over a widow's chances never once thought to count Bertha Palmer's nerve, her willingness to back her own judgment against the whole crowd, as an asset at all. They saw the pearls at her throat and the orchids in her hair and filed her under-ornament. They missed the collector underneath, the woman who had spent a fortune on paintings nobody wanted and lived to watch the world admit she had been right the entire time. She would do it again, with cattle, in a swamp. And she took, in 1893, the largest public stage the age could offer a woman, the presidency of the Board of Lady Managers of the World's Columbian Exposition, the Great Chicago World's Fair, where she stood before the crowds and said the line that still carries her voice across the years. Even more important, she told them, than the discovery of Columbus, which we are gathered to celebrate, is the fact that the government has just discovered women. Ability, she said on another day, is not a matter of sex. And of the working women whose labour the comfortable liked to pity or ignore, she said the flat, hard truth. They must work, she said, or they must starve. The stage she said it from was the largest the age could offer a woman. The fair drew more than 27 million people in a single summer, and the board she led ran to 117 women drawn from every state in the Union, the first women ever given an official hand in the running of a World's Fair. They raised a woman's building, designed by the first woman ever to take an architecture degree from the great technical school in Boston, and hung it with a vast mural of the modern woman by Mary Cassatt, a canvas some 50 feet across. And the castle she went home to each night was its own kind of statement. 42 rooms of grey limestone budgeted at $90,000 that had cost, in the end, more than $1 million. A tower rising 70 feet, a great hall under a dome of glass, and not a single door in the whole pile that a hand could open from the outside. She was, in short, no ornament waiting to be tested. She had run a city's society, a World's Fair, and an art collection of international standing while her husband still lived. But the men who counted a fortune could not see past the word widow, and when Potter Palmer died in 1902 and left her, against all the lawyers' advice, essentially the whole of an $8 million estate, the certainty settled over Chicago like weather. She would lose it. A woman handed that much money would fritter it into the ground within the decade. There is even a story, worn smooth from retelling and impossible now to pin to any document, that when someone questioned leaving it all to a widow who might one day remarry, Potter waved it away with a line about her next husband. He would need it, Potter is supposed to have said. Whether he ever said it or not, the sentiment was the age's own, and it was wrong, and Bertha Palmer was about to prove it wrong in the least likely place on the map of the United States, in the cattle country and citrus swamp of the far Florida coast. Chapter 7. She doubled it in a swamp. The society queen answered the men who thought a widow could not hold a fortune by learning to run cattle on the Florida frontier. She was past 60 when she did it, a woman who had reigned in marble and Monets. and she went down to a raw stretch of the Gulf Coast around a small town called Sarasota and bought land the way she had once bought paintings, with an eye that saw value where others saw nothing. She had been someone else entirely before she came to the swamp. This was the woman of whom her own husband had once said, watching her cross a ballroom in her jewels, "There she stands, with $200,000 just on her neck." This was the reigning hostess of Chicago, the collector of Monets, the president of a World's Fair, a woman the papers had spent 30 years describing in the language of pearls and orchids. And here she was, in a wide-brimmed hat, on a Florida cattle ranch, arguing over drainage canals and the dipping of cattle and the price of 1,000 head of Brahman stock, doing the one kind of work no society column had ever imagined for her, and doing it well enough to make the doubters look like fools. She bought vast, on a scale that still astonishes. More than 80,000 acres by the careful counts, and by the larger ones something approaching a third of the whole county. Tens of thousands of acres of pasture and scrub and swamp and citrus, held under the hand of a Chicago widow the newspapers had expected to see ruined by then. And she worked it. This is the part that turns the story from spectacle into something harder and finer. She might have parked the money in bonds and lived quietly on the interest. Instead, she built a working empire of agriculture out of the Florida wild. She ran a 15,000-acre ranch along the Marietta River, brought in Brahman cattle, introduced the dipping of cattle to kill the ticks that plagued the herds, laid out a 10,000-acre farm settlement with canals to drain and water it, planted citrus, sank wells, ran experiments, shipped 1,000 head of cattle north in a single season in what was then a record for the county, and paid her hundreds of workers the highest farm wages in the region. She leaned on the railroad to extend its line south to serve her lands, and the town grew up around the enterprise until Sarasota itself became, in large part, her monument. By the end, she ran a herd of some 2,200 head of cattle and kept as many as 300 people at work, at wages that shamed the region's usual rates. She had drained swamp into pasture, turned scrub into citrus groves, dug the canals and sunk the wells, and bent a railroad to her purpose. And she had done every bit of it as a widow past 60, who had never in her life been asked to do anything harder than plan a dinner for 400. There is a particular kind of courage in that, and it went almost entirely unremarked at the time, because the world had no story ready for a society queen who could also run a cattle empire. She was supposed to fade into a soft and harmless widowhood, hosting teas and slowly spending down the pile her husband had left. Instead, she went to the roughest edge of the country and built something new out of it with her own judgment and her own money, and the men who had counted the days until a foolish widow ruined herself were left to watch her raise a small empire out of the Florida wild. The fortune her husband's lawyers had watched with such dread, she turned, over her 16 widowed years, into something on the order of twice its size. She doubled it. She took the fortune the men were sure a widow would lose, and she made it grow in the one arena, cattle and swamp and frontier real estate, where a society queen had no business succeeding, and she succeeded anyway, with returns no one had thought she could earn. Her collapse to a single image is the gentlest and the strangest of the four. Picture the woman in her sealed limestone castle far to the north, the fortress with no handle on the outside of any door, jewels at her throat and a Monet on the wall. And then, set beside her, that same woman in a wide-brimmed hat on the deck of a Florida ranch house, watching 1,000 head of cattle raise dust toward the railhead, quietly turning $8 million into 20 by draining a swamp. The glamour was always the part the world watched. The steel was underneath it the whole time, and she only got to show it once the husband and the doubt were gone. She died in 1918 of breast cancer, quietly, at her Florida estate among the orange groves, a continent away from the ballroom where she had reigned. They carried her body home to Chicago and let her lie in state inside the castle with the doors that opened only from within. The Queen sealed one last time in the fortress of her own life before they buried her beside Potter. She left her Monets and her Renoirs to the Art Institute of Chicago, where they still hang as the heart of its collection, and she left behind her in Florida the ranches and drained fields that would in time become parks and towns and roads bearing her family's name. The society queen the men had pitied as a soon-to-be ruined widow died richer than her husband had left her, admired, undefeated, and entirely her own. And here the film must stop and mark her out, because she is the one who breaks the pattern. Marietta paid for her throne with a son. The widow who comes last would pay for hers with nearly everything a life is made of. But Bertha Palmer won, cleanly, publicly, and kept her dignity and her Monets and her good name all the way to the grave. And the worst that can be said of her is that she proved a roomful of lawyers wrong. She is the light before the dark. Because the first three widows seized doorways and empires and estates, and mostly they won, and mostly they paid in coin a person can bear to pay. The fourth seized the money itself, the raw machinery of American finance, and the price of that throne was the highest in this film, and she paid it in a currency of black cloth and cold rooms and a child's ruined leg. Chapter 8. The heiress they locked out of her own money. Hetty Robinson was born to a whaling fortune, and every single person who should have handed it to her tried instead to lock it away. This is the wound at the center of the darkest life in this film, and everything the world would later call madness or witchcraft or monstrous greed grows straight out of it. She was born in 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, into old Quaker money made on the whaling fleets and the China trade, one of the great maritime fortunes of New England. She should have been raised in the certainty of it. Instead, she was sent, very small, to live with her grandfather and her aunt, and there she found the only thing that ever felt to her like solid ground: numbers. She read the stock quotations aloud to her grandfather. By 6, she was reading the financial papers to her father every day. By her own account, by the time she was 15, she knew more about money than many a grown man, and she was almost certainly right. The money she was born to had been pulled out of the sea. New Bedford in those years was the whaling capital of the world, and the Robinsons and the Howlands were among its first families, Quaker merchants whose ships hunted whales in distant oceans and whose counting houses turned the oil into one of the great fortunes of New England. Hetty grew up amphibious between the drawing room and the ledger, and she chose the ledger. While the other girls of her class were taught the accomplishments that decorated a wife, she was learning the one thing that would ever matter to her: how money moved and where it hid, and how a patient hand could make it grow. She had been sent away young, out of her own parents' house and into her grandfather's and her Aunt Sylvia's, and something in that early handing off never quite left her. Her mother was often ill and mostly absent, and when the mother died, the money went to a man and left the daughter almost nothing. The aunt she nursed and lived beside for years, and when that aunt died in turn and left her fortune fenced behind trustees and charities rather than handed freely to the niece who had tended her, it landed as one more betrayal in a life that was starting to look, to the girl living it, like a long procession of people deciding she could not be trusted with what was rightfully hers. Then, one by one, the people who held the family fortune died, and one by one they arranged for her not to have it. Her mother died when Hetty was a young woman and left an estate of over $100,000, and it passed to Hetty's father, and Hetty received a house worth some $8,000 and nothing more. Her father died a few years later and left $5 or $6 million, and Hetty, the only child, the girl who had read him the markets since she was 6, received under $1 million of it outright. The rest, some $5 million, was locked into a trust that would pay her the income and never let her touch the body of the money. 2 weeks after her father, her aunt died and left around $2 million, and gave roughly half to charity and locked most of Hetty's share, again in a trust beyond her reach. Everywhere she turned, the fortune that was morally hers was fenced off behind trustees and conditions handed to her in a cage. She fought. Over her aunt's estate, she went to court, producing an earlier will that left her everything outright, with a second page attached that was meant to void any later document, and the executors cried forgery. The case became famous for a reason that had nothing to do with Hetty and everything to do with the future, because a mathematician named Benjamin Pierce was called to testify on the odds that the disputed signature could match a genuine one so perfectly by honest chance, and he put the number at something like 1 in more than 2 sextillion, a figure with 21 zeros after it, one of the first times probability itself was marched into an American courtroom. The court, in the end, set the mathematics aside, ruled her own testimony inadmissible, and decided against her. The forgery finding stood. She did not get the outright fortune she believed was hers. Think of what that verdict told her. She had grown up the sharpest mind in every counting house she entered, a girl who could read a market before she could properly dance. And now a court had branded her a forger and handed the money she believed was rightfully hers to trustees, to charities, to the discretion of other people. Whether she had in truth tampered with the will hardly mattered to the shape it pressed into her, because the lesson came out the same on either reading. The people who were supposed to secure her had lawyered her fortune away instead. The institutions that were supposed to stand neutral had called her a liar and believed the men. Trust no one. Sign nothing away. Hold what is yours in your own 2 hands, where no judge and no relative and no husband can ever again fence it off behind glass and call it kindness. She walked out of that courtroom a wealthy woman by any ordinary measure, and a robbed one by her own, and the distance between those 2 feelings would drive every hard, cold decision of the next 50 years. What she got instead was a lesson, carved deep, that would run under every hard and frightening thing she ever did. The people who should love you and secure you will instead try to take your money and lock you out of it. And the only safety on this earth is money in your own 2 hands, controlled by no one, trusted to no one, held so tight that no court and no father and no husband can ever fence it away again. That was the armor, and she began to forge it early, and she never once took it off. The world would spend her whole life calling the armor greed and madness and witchcraft. It was, if you follow the story back to its root, something much simpler and much sadder. It was a dispossessed girl deciding that she would never, ever be dispossessed again. Chapter 9. The Woman on the Men's Floor. When Hetty Robinson married, she made her husband sign away every claim to her money before she would take his name. She was 32, and she chose a wealthy man, Edward Green, who had made his own fortune of about $1 million in the Far East trade, and by every ordinary expectation of the age, his marrying her would have folded her money into his the instant they wed. Coverture again, the same door that had closed on every woman in this film. But Hetty had watched too many men and too many courts reach for her fortune to hand it now to one more. She demanded a settlement that kept her money entirely her own, made Edward renounce all right to it, and married him only behind that wall. Her father, who had understood his daughter, had built the same wall into his will, ordering her inheritance kept free from the control of any husband she might take. Between the dead father's clause and the living husband's signature, Hetty Green did what almost no married woman of her century could do. She kept her money as her own, and then she went to work with it. The marriage did not stay a partnership. Edward Green speculated with his own fortune and lost, and in the middle of the 1880s, a banking house that held Hetty's securities went down under the weight of his debts, and the bank tried to make her paper good for what her husband owed. She descended on the place, pulled her millions out, paid only what she chose to pay, and walked away from the marriage in every way but the legal one. They never divorced. They simply lived apart, the wealthiest woman in the country, and the husband who had nearly cost her the very independence she had married him to protect, and she was said never to have forgiven him. The lesson of her whole life had come true inside her own house. A man she had chosen and trusted had reached for her money, and only the walls she had built before the wedding had saved it. The work she chose was the one arena in America that shut women out most completely, the trading floors and lending desks of Wall Street, and she walked into it in her widow's black and made herself, in the words of one account, a major and a feared operator. She would not even pay for an office. She set herself up instead on the floor of a bank, the Chemical National Bank on Broadway, sitting among her trunks and her ledgers and her securities, a woman doing a man's business in the middle of a man's building and refusing to spend $1 on the dignity of a door with her name on it. Her method, she stated plainly, and it reads today like the founding scripture of value investing, half a century before anyone gave it that name. I buy, she said, when things are low and nobody wants them, and I keep them until they go up and people are crazy to get them. She had a whole gospel of it, delivered in a flat New England drawl to any reporter foolish enough to expect a witch. There was no great secret in fortune-making, she would say. You bought cheap and sold dear. You were thrifty and shrewd, and you never once let up. She told women in particular to learn the things she had learned, that a girl should be raised able to make her own living whether or not she would ever inherit a cent, that every woman ought to understand a mortgage and a bond and the quiet way that interest compounds. It is the duty of every woman, she said, to learn to take care of her own business affairs. She was handing a sex the law had kept ignorant of money on purpose, the exact hard knowledge that had made her the most powerful woman in American finance. She bought cheap government bonds in the country's dark hours, first mortgages on solid land, railroad paper battered down in a panic, and she held, and she waited, and she was patient in a way the plungers around her never learned to be. And the money grew and grew until she was the largest single lender in the city of New York. The scale of it, tallied up, is hard to hold in the mind. Her first year investing out of London, she was said to have cleared $1.25 million. By the middle of the 1880s, she was worth some $26 million. She favoured first mortgages above all, telling anyone who asked that first mortgages were good enough for her. And she came in time to hold more mortgages and to lend more money, single-handed, than almost anyone in New York. And she did it all from a corner of a bank lobby in her widow's black, keeping her own books, answering to no partner, no board, and no man alive. The men did not know what to make of her, and mostly they sneered. The railroad baron Collis Huntington, tangling with her once over a debt that touched her son, dismissed her as nothing more than a glorified pawnbroker. She gave him back a line that ought to be carved somewhere. Up to now, Huntington, she told him, you have dealt with Hetty Green, the businesswoman. Now you are fighting Hetty Green, the mother. She fought the press the same way, telling anyone who would listen that her life was written for her down in Wall Street by people who did not care to know one iota of the real Hetty Green. And underneath the sneers and the caricatures, she was compounding a fortune that would end larger than any American woman had ever held. And she knew exactly what she was, and said so without a flicker of doubt. "I am able," she said, "to manage my affairs better than any man could manage them." The century had spent her girlhood telling her that money belonged in a man's hands. She had built her whole life into the standing rebuttal, and the proof of it was about to walk in through the front door of every bank in New York in the autumn of 1907, when the men who had sneered came to her with their hats in their hands. Chapter 10. The Panic That Proved Her Right. In the autumn of 1907, as the banks of New York went down one after another like a row of falling weights, the men of Wall Street sent for the widow in black. It was the vindication of her whole strange life, and it arrived exactly as she had told them it would. She had seen the trouble coming years before it broke. "I saw this situation developing 3 years ago," she said, "and I am on record as predicting it." And she had done the thing that her patience and her hard, cold reading of the markets always told her to do. She had moved to cash. While the plungers around her borrowed and speculated and built their fortunes on air, Hetty Green kept her place in the bank with her bonds and her ledgers and a great reserve of ready money, waiting for the day the air ran out. In 1907, the air ran out. It spread the way fear always spreads through banks, from one shaky house to the next, depositors lining up in the autumn cold to pull their savings out before the doors could close for good. Credit vanished from the city almost overnight. Money was called in, hoarded, locked away, until there was almost none to be had at any price in the largest financial center in the country. And in the middle of that drought sat one old woman who had seen it coming and had spent the whole year doing nothing but wait with her reserves in cash, holding the one thing that everyone had suddenly and desperately come to need. When the panic hit, credit vanished from the city overnight. Banks that had seemed eternal in October were begging for cash by November, and the city of New York itself, the government of the largest city in the country, found that it could not borrow the money it needed to keep running. And so the city came to the woman they had spent 30 years calling a witch and a miser and a glorified pawnbroker, and she answered. She had already lent the city something like $4.5 million in the months before the crash, and now, at the worst of it, she handed over more, and she took in return the city's short-term paper, its promise to repay. She lent at 6%. She could have charged far more, and she knew precisely how much more. And she said so afterward with the flat pride of a woman who had never once been given credit for decency. "I might just as easily," she said, "have secured 40%. She had kept great reserves precisely so that when everyone else was ruined, she could lend. And that was the final proof of the argument her whole life had been making. The men had built the temple of American money and barred its door to women. And when the temple caught fire, it was a widow in mourning black who carried the water. She had been mocked as a miser for every dollar she refused to spend. And in the worst week of a generation, the country finally saw what all that refusing had been for. When the crash came, she said, "I had money, and I was one of the very few who really had it." The single image of her triumph is the one the men of that world would least have chosen and could least deny. When the greatest banker of the age, John Pierpont Morgan, gathered the powers of American finance into his own library to stop the panic by force of will, the room was full of the titans of the century, the men who owned the railroads and the steel and the banks, and every one of them was a man, save one. Hetty Green was there, the only woman summoned into the room where the money of the United States was being saved, sitting among the lords of Wall Street in her plain, worn mourning, because when the whole system cracked, she was one of the few solid things left standing in it. Even where the record is thin, the scene is easy to summon. A room full of frock coats and gold watch chains, and the hard, closed faces of the men who owned the century, and one woman among them in mourning black, older than most, plainer than all, and richer than very nearly any of them. She had outlasted the sneer of the glorified pawnbroker. She had outlasted the trustees and the courts and the husband and the whole long chorus that had told a girl in New Bedford that money was a man's business and no concern of hers. She sat in the room where the money of a nation was being saved because she had made herself impossible to leave out of it. And that was as far through the one door as any woman in this film would ever walk. The ornament the age had trained a woman to be, the beautiful, useless thing hung on a man to show his worth, had become the operator. This entire film has been climbing toward. The widow who held a fortune and used it to steady a nation's largest city in the worst week of a generation. She had answered every man who ever fenced her money away, every trustee and every court and every sneering baron, in the one language none of them could argue with. She had more money than they did, and she had held her nerve when theirs broke. And when the country needed a lender of last resort, it found her seated among the clerks of a bank in a dress that had seen better decades. It was the summit of her life. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes hers the darkest throne in this film, is what the climb had cost, and what it had done to the people she loved, and to the woman she might otherwise have been. Chapter 11. What the Black Veil Hid. The richest woman in the world lived in a $19 flat in Hoboken under a false name, and her son wore a leg of cork. Both of those facts are true, and between them lies the whole price of the fortune. She would not keep a grand house. She could have afforded a dozen of them, but a fixed and splendid residence in New York would have fixed her also to New York's taxes, and Hetty Green would sooner die than pay a tax she could evade. So she drifted between cheap rooms in Brooklyn and Hoboken, moving to dodge the assessors, registering under invented names, living in a flat that cost her $19 a month under the nameplate of a made-up tenant. She is said to have fled Hoboken itself, rather than pay a dog license that came to $2. She registered under the name of one of her own dogs to throw the assessors off, shifted rooms whenever they drew near, and carried her wealth in her head and her bag, so that no clerk could ever pin it to an address. She would not keep an office, and late in her life she began to move from one bank to the next, out of a fixed conviction that someone meant to poison her. The arithmetic of it is almost unbelievable. A woman worth on the order of $100 million, and perhaps far more. For no one could ever say with certainty because she kept no fixed home and left no inventory, doing battle over $2, because the money had never really been about comfort at all. It had always been about safety. And for a woman who had spent her girlhood watching the fortune torn out of her hands, there was never going to be enough safety in the whole world to let her spend a single dollar in peace. She wore one plain black dress until it wore through, and heavy black mourning veils that covered her face, and carried her securities from bank to bank in the same battered bag that held her cold lunch. That is where the name came from. The Witch of Wall Street. Strip the word of its cruelty, and you can see plainly how they arrived at it. Here was a woman alone in the temple of male money, dressed head to foot in the black of mourning, veiled, secretive, moving through the banks with a battered bag, refusing every softness the rich were supposed to buy. To the hostile male press of the age, a widow in black who beat men at their own game was something uncanny, something to be feared and mocked. A witch. Whether there was anything truly strange in her, beyond a grief she never took off, and a genius they could not forgive in a woman, the age never troubled to ask. It saw the veil and the bag and the hard eyes. and it reached for the oldest word it had for a powerful woman it did not understand. And then there is the leg, and here the film must slow down and tell you the truth in all its awful uncertainty, because it is the single darkest charge against her, and it is also the place where the legend and the record pull hardest against each other. Her son, Ned, injured his leg as a boy. The injury festered, and in time the leg was amputated and he wore a cork limb for the rest of his life. The story the world remembers, the story that put Hetty Green in the record books as the greatest miser who ever lived, is that she was too cheap to pay for his care, that she dragged the boy from one free clinic to another, and that at one charity ward she was recognized as the rich witch of Wall Street and turned away, and that the delay from her stinginess is what cost her son his leg. It is a monstrous image, and it may not be true, because there is another record, and it is at least as strong. Her son himself said in later years that the injury had not been so serious, and that the amputation only became necessary when he was already grown. Her biographer found that she spent years consulting and paying the best doctors she could find, that she moved to another city to be near his care, that she was seen carrying her great heavy son through the streets herself. A family account says she went from doctor to doctor for 3 days, searching for one who believed he could save the leg rather than take it. Hold both of those in your mind at once, because the truth of Hetty Green lives in the space between them, and you will not get a cleaner answer than that. Maybe the woman who would not pay $2 for a dog license flinched for a fatal moment at a doctor's bill for her own child. Maybe the press took one ugly episode at a charity ward and built a monster out of it to punish a woman for being rich and strange and female. Maybe both are true, in the way that people are rarely only one thing. What is certain is the ending, and it is as eerie as anything in this film. When Ned came at last to die, he asked that the amputated leg, buried decades before, be dug up and laid in the casket with the rest of him, so that he could go into the ground whole. The son of the woman with more money than almost anyone alive, gathering up the piece of himself the fortune may or may not have cost him to take it down into the dark. There is her collapse to a single image, the one the whole hook promised. A stooped woman in a single frayed black dress and a heavy veil, seated on the floor of a bank among her trunks, a battered black bag of the city's debt in her lap, eating cold oatmeal off a radiator, owning more money than almost any man alive and trusting not one soul on the earth with $1 of it. She had seized the largest throne in this film, the money itself, the raw machinery of American finance, and she had held it whole to the end. She died in 1916, past 80, still in her black, still worth more than any other woman alive. She kept the fortune intact. And the fortune, by then, was very nearly all that was left of the life, which is the price the last and greatest of these widows paid, and the darkest answer this film can give to the question of what the door cost the women who walked through it. Chapter 12. The monuments outlived the women. Walk the same streets today, and the marble is mostly gone, and what little remains almost never remembers the women who paid for it. That is the first hard truth of the aftermath, and it runs through all 4 of these lives like a cold draft under a door. The Fifth Avenue Hotel, the marble engine of the whole Stevens fortune, the grandest hotel in America in its day, with a fireplace in every room and 400 servants and the first passenger elevator the country had ever seen, closed its doors at midnight one night in 1908, its last patrons running up a farewell bar tab of $7,000, and was pulled down, replaced by an office block within a year of the wreckers arriving. The great limestone castle Bertha Palmer built on Lake Shore Drive, the fortress, with no handle on the outside of any door, was razed to the ground in the middle of the 20th century, its towers and its domed hall gone as though they had never stood. Mary Cassatt's vast mural of the modern woman, the centerpiece of Bertha's World's Fair, celebrated by millions in that one bright summer, vanished after the fair closed and has never been found. The stone and the canvas that these fortunes raised proved as mortal as the people who raised them, and faster to forget. And the forgetting fell hardest on the women. The men of the age, the railroad kings, and the steel masters and the bankers kept their names on libraries and universities and whole streets. The women who had matched them, door for door and dollar for dollar, mostly did not. Marietta survives as a footnote and a fictional climber in a novel. Miriam survives, when she survives at all, as a strange anecdote about a lady who called herself by a man's name. Bertha is a name on a Chicago hotel and a scatter of Florida roads. And Hetty survives as a cartoon witch in a book of records, filed under greatest miser, the genius sanded away to leave only the caricature behind. The fortunes fell, and the monuments fell, and then the memory of the women themselves was quietly put away under a single dismissive word, a peace. And yet the erasure was never quite complete, or this film could not exist. The paintings still hang in Chicago with a widow's name beside them. The vote that a scandalous woman's fortune helped to win is still cast, every autumn, by women who have never once heard her name. Somewhere, a student of the markets still turns over the plain, hard rules of the woman they called a witch. The monuments came down, and the names wore thin. But the work each of these widows did with the power she seized outlasted the marble, and outlasted the cruel words, and reached far past the short lives that made it. And the money itself, the thing they had seized at such cost, scattered almost as quickly. Look at what became of the greatest hoard of the four. Hetty Green kept her fortune whole and hard through 80 years of grief and battle, held it against every hand that reached for it, and then she died. And it split in two between her children, and within a single generation it was gone in both directions at once. Her son Ned, who had spent his whole life under her thumb and her thrift, spent the inheritance as fast as she had refused to, on every whim the old woman had ever denied him. He built a country estate he called Round Hill, paid $20,000 for a single famous sheet of misprinted airmail stamps, bought one of the rarest coins in the country, poured money into wireless experiments, and died with something over $40 million, a great sum, and a fraction of what he had been handed. Her daughter Sylvia did the opposite and reached the same end. She lived quietly, married late behind the same kind of ironclad settlement her mother had demanded, and when she died, she gave almost the entire fortune away to 64 colleges and churches and hospitals, keeping back barely more than $1 million of the $200 million she had held. The hoard the mother built by trusting no one was burned by the son and given away by the daughter. And the name that had terrified Wall Street simply thinned into the air. That is the pattern under all four of these lives. Once the seizing is done, and the seizer is gone. The thing each widow fought so hard to take did not stay taken. Marietta's hard-won place in society died with her and left a character in another woman's novel. Miriam's empire folded, and her fortune passed into other women's hands. Bertha's castle came down, and her ranches became suburbs. Hetty's great hoard scattered in a single generation, some of it burned, most of it given away, all of it gone from the family name inside 40 years. They had spent their whole lives reaching through the one door for something solid to hold, and what they closed their hands on turned out, in the end, to be as mortal as they were. So ask the question the whole film has been circling. Was the throne worth the price? Marietta clawed her way into the drawing rooms of people who despised her, and the drawing rooms and the hotel and the enemy's mansion are all dust now. And what survives of her is a character in another woman's novel, the climbing widow immortalized by the girl her son was forbidden to marry. Miriam Leslie built and rebuilt an empire and buried a self so deep we cannot find it, and the illustrated papers are gone and forgotten, and what survives of her is the vote, carried by other women, cast by their granddaughters, bought in part with her strange money. Bertha Palmer doubled a fortune the men were sure she would lose, and the castle is rubble, and the ranch is subdivisions. And what survives of her is a wall of Monets in a Chicago museum and a Florida city that grew up around her cattle. Hetty Green seized the money itself and held it whole, and the money is scattered, and the woman is a punchline in a book of records. And what survives of her, under the caricature, is the simple fact that she was right. The monuments fell. The women were erased or reduced to a costume and a nickname, and the freedom they had each seized turned out to be, like the black they wore to seize it, something borrowed for a while from the dead. Chapter 13. The door closes behind them. Every one of these women was handed her freedom by a coffin, and every one of them, in the end, paid it back. That is the pattern the four of them make when you set their lives side by side, and it is the thesis this film has been building toward from the first locked door. They were the ordinary product of the age, of a system that trained women to hold up fortunes and forbade them to hold them, and then, through the one crack in it, let a widow reach through and take what she had been denied. Marietta wanted the doors, and she got them, and it cost her a son. Miriam wanted to bury a shameful self, and she did, and she gave the buried self's fortune to free her whole sex. Bertha was doubted, and she answered the doubt with returns no man had thought a widow could earn. Hetty was dispossessed, again and again, by everyone who should have secured her, and she answered by seizing more money than any woman in America had ever held, and trusting not one living soul with $1 of it. They were called hard names for it, all of them, and the names have stuck harder than the truth. A climber, an adventuress, a domineering widow, a witch. The same age that would not let them own a thing while their husbands lived was quick to punish them for owning too much once the husbands were gone, because a woman who took real power was a kind of scandal in herself, a thing that needed a cruel word to make it safe to look at. Strip the cruel words away, though, and look plainly at what these four actually did. They held great fortunes steady. They ran empires and estates and the lending desks of a nation. They doubled money and rescued companies and helped buy millions of women the vote. They were, every one of them, exactly as capable as the men who had spent a century insisting that they were not, and the only thing they ever lacked was permission, granted at last to each of them, only by a death. 4 widows, 4 thrones, 1 door, and the same cruel condition written over all of them. It opened only when the man died. That is the indictment underneath the glamour, and it should be said plainly at the end. These were formidable women, every one of them. Women who ran empires and steadied cities and doubled fortunes and bent a whole society to their will, and the age let them do almost none of it while their husbands lived. The world got Hetty Green the financier, and Bertha Palmer the rancher, and Miriam Leslie the publisher, and Marietta Stevens the power only after a funeral, only through the widow's black, only once the man who owned them in law was in the ground. Everything they proved they could do, they proved too late for the marriage to matter, and the measure of what the age wasted is the distance between the ornament each was made to be, and the operator each turned out to have been all along. And notice what each of them had to become to do it, because the age exacted a price for every freedom it granted. It made them pay in the only coin it had, and the coin was always some part of the woman herself. Marietta traded a son's happiness for a foothold in a ballroom. Miriam traded her whole past, her name, her face, the very mother who bore her, for an empire and a coronet she invented out of air. Bertha traded 16 years of a widow's solitude, and then her life, for the satisfaction of proving a roomful of men wrong. And Hetty traded warmth itself, every comfort and nearly every human tie, for a fortune she guarded like a wound that would not close. They got out. Every one of them got out. But the door only ever opened once the husband was in the ground, and it took its toll from each of them on the way through. Which brings us back to where we began, to a stooped figure in a frayed black dress and a heavy mourning veil, seated on the floor of a bank with a battered black bag in her lap. The richest woman in America, dressed as the poorest. The widow who took the largest throne of them all. Hetty Green had said the truest thing any of these four ever said about the door and the cage and the way out. And she said it as plain instruction, the way a mother tells a daughter the one thing she must never forget. It is the duty of every woman, she said, to learn to take care of her own business affairs. She had learned it in a courtroom that called her a forger, in a father's will that locked her out, in a marriage she armoured against before she would enter it. She had spent a lifetime proving it at her post in a bank, in a dress that had seen better decades. And when the age finally opened its one narrow door for her, and for Marietta and Miriam and Bertha, it opened, every time, onto a coffin. They walked through it in black, and they took what was theirs, and the door swung shut behind them, and the fortunes they had seized blew away like ash while the world remembered them, when it remembered them at all, as a climber, an empress, a queen, and a witch. If a story told this way is why you stayed to the end, subscribe, because this is the kind of history I dig up every week. And tell me which of these four widows you would have wanted at your own dinner table, which one you would have feared, and where you are watching from. I read them all.